A lot of controversy this week in Parliament around reaction to Israel and Hamas. Yesterday there was a motion by the government, supported by the opposition, to condemn the attacks by Hamas and support Israel. The Greens did not support that. They do say they condemn the attacks, though. I spoke to the Greens leader a short time ago. Adam Bandt, thanks for your time. So this motion in Parliament's got a lot of attention that condemn the Hamas attacks, amongst other things. In isolation, is that something you agree with, that these attacks that have set this latest iteration off were abhorrent?
Yes, and the Greens have condemned the attacks of Hamas. They amount to war crimes, and taking of hostages is a war crime, and we've condemned them in the strongest possible terms, did as soon as they occurred and continue to do so. But the motion in Parliament went further than that. And as we're hearing reports from the United Nations that orders from the Israeli military for people to evacuate amounted to a death sentence, that people were being denied food and water and petrol. We had a looming invasion of Gaza, which is 2.2 million people in an area half the size of Canberra, 40% of whom are under children. And instead of also condemning that invasion and calling for the invasion to stop, Liberal and Labor backed it. Now, that is not something that we can support. And what we warned at the time was that this looming invasion was going to turn a humanitarian disaster into a humanitarian catastrophe. Sadly, that is what we are witnessing. And we're calling on the government to change its position and now call on the Israeli military to stop the invasion.
In terms of what's reasonable for Israel, do they have a right to respond to those initial attacks? In particular, what they aim to do, they say, is stop them happening again by destroying Hamas's military capability. Is that a fair enough aim?
International law is very clear. Any response cannot involve an attack on civilians. And the cutting off of food and of fuel and of water to an area where there's 2.2 million people, many of them children, is leading people to starve and dehydrate to death. And they're not my words. That's the words of the United Nations and people who are on the ground. That is not justified. That crosses a line.
So would it be justified then, whatever action Israel takes that is targeted, that destroys Hamas's military capability, is that something they would be justified doing?
What we need now, and what we know, is that when you back an invasion of such a densely populated area where people are walled in and have nowhere to go, and Gaza is effectively a walled-in primary school, when you back an invasion of substantial bombing of that area, then civilians are put in harm's way.
So is what you're saying
that is why we've said we condemn the Hamas attacks unequivocally, and now the way to respond, though, is not to go in and rain bombs on a densely populated area. Well, we need an immediate ceasefire of all parties. The invasion needs to stop. The international community needs to join the push to stop the invasion, then take steps to ensure that the hostages are released, and then work out and have an immediate ceasefire, and to work out then how to have a just and lasting peace. But an invasion in a densely populated area where so many people and children are at risk is not only abhorrent, it breaks international law.
Isn't there an issue, though, that if Israel did want to destroy that capability of Hamas, that they are going to need, sort of a scale of attacks in terms of rockets? They're trying to destroy pretty significant capability, and there's been repeated examples over many years of Hamas actually using civilians as a shield. So do we need to take with a grain of salt whether Israel is always necessarily targeting these civilians or they're put in harm's way?
No, you can't take the potential slaughter of thousands of people with a grain of salt. Like the facts are as they are.
But what are the facts in terms of what Hamas is doing around?
We know what the situation in Gaza is. We know there are 2.2 million people there with nowhere to go. Right? And this is why. At the time that we were asked to consider the motion, we had in front of us the United Nations saying these orders that the Israeli military is giving to people to move amount to a death sentence because there is nowhere for them to go. They are walled in. There is no water. There is no food. Those are the facts that we were confronted with. And And in that situation, you have to respect not only humanity, but international law as well.
Is there any right for Israel to defend itself from this attack and try to stop future ones?
Countries always have the rights to defend themselves. They've got that right under international law.
You're basically saying
we have crossed that line. We have crossed that line, and we'd crossed that line at the time that the motion was being considered by Parliament.
What would you consider reasonable action from the Israeli Defence Force to stop a future Hamas attack?
Well, we've made that clear. Like, if the question is about how to ensure a just and lasting peace in Palestine, and I repeat the point that all people in Israel, all people in Palestine are entitled to live in peace and security, that involves a stable, lasting peace for everyone in there, which may well involve what you just said in relation to Hamas. That is going to start with saying we need to end the occupation and then work with the international community to ensure that just and lasting peace. Then, and only then, are you going to have Israelis living in the peace and security that they're entitled to, just like Palestinians.
But you wouldn't think there's any action, reasonable action Israel could take to right now, in the short term? I understand you've made your point around the other elements.
Tom, we have to deal...
to actually stop Hamas being able to do this again.
This is about the fact...
Because this is a terror organisation. We're not talking about the Palestinian people. This is a terror organisation.
Yeah, we're not talking... That's right. And
are they really going to...
There's a very big difference between the two, and I think you would find everyone in Parliament accepting that. We have to deal with the facts as they are now, and we have to deal with this massive invasion on a people who are walled in and have nowhere to go. And the question for the Australian government is, do you back the invasion, which is what Labor and Liberal are doing, or do you work to ensure a ceasefire and end to the invasion and peace? And that's what we're...
Is it reasonable to think that there will be proper peace and a ceasefire with Hamas particularly, given it's not only a terror organisation, but it also, as part of its credo, it doesn't want Jewish people to exist?
Well, we've been very, very clear that we need a just and lasting peace. So
but what I'm asking is, can that happen with Hamas or not?
People that in Israel can live in security, and people in Palestine can live in peace.
The question is around Hamas,
and that involves creating the structures so that the people there can self-determine their own future.
Perhaps the best part of that would be destroying Hamas, which it's basically this one-party state now in Palestine, where there are a lot of people who don't want to be under control of them. So maybe it'd be good for Palestinians if Hamas was destroyed.
But what is happening is that it's hospitals that are being destroyed, and it's people's lives and children. Well, the claim from Israel is this was by a Hamas rocket that was misfired. The Israeli military has already changed their story. It's firstly saying that, then saying it was Islamic Jihad, and that's been denied by Islamic Jihad. And I noticed that reporters are on the ground saying, well, you often hear this response from the Israeli military. But in any event, okay, there will no doubt there will be further unfolding and information about that. But this is exactly what we said is going to happen when you back an invasion in a densely populated area of 2.2 million people in half the size of Canberra, where about half of them are under 15. Okay, now, when that happens, because there is nowhere for these people to go. And the United Nations was telling us that before this bombardment began. This is what the Greens were saying in Parliament. And this situation, unfortunately, looks like getting worse unless there's an end to the invasion and a ceasefire.
But even if it's in horrid, brutal circumstances, the end of Hamas's capability and perhaps rule might be a good thing for that peace you spoke about.
Well, if international law is very clear, whatever, like one atrocity does not justify another. And whatever one might say, the Hamas perpetrators need to be held to account for their war crimes, but that does not justify a bombing and attacking of civilians who, as you said before,
is the most realistic way of holding to the account,
may be very different from the leadership.
Them being taken out. I mean, is that the only way they'll really be held to account?
What is happening at the moment, Tom? Happening at the moment, Tom?
But if it's more targeted in some way, is that realistically the only way they would be held to account? I know you're saying international law. We're not going to see them in a court one day,
2.2 million people in an area half the size of Canberra, almost half of them children, and there's somehow this, I don't know if this is what you're alluding to, but somehow this suggestion that they can have all their food and water and supplies cut off and massive bombardment, and that it somehow only attacks a small group. No,